experience as a Steadicam operator in the early 2000s, working as a daily operator on various episodic shows that were shooting in Toronto. So I had a little taste of doing days here and there on shows, and I thought, this isn't. I didn't really enjoy it as a. I couldn't see myself getting into it as a cinematographer, and I already was shooting and DPing a lot of commercials and indie projects and things, and I enjoyed that kind of work that I was doing. So I really didn't pursue it. But that was a different time of television, and then years go by, and then it's 2014, and starting to see what was happening on the streaming platforms, and thinking like, wow, like there's like this is a whole new type of storytelling. These like larger scope, multi-episode shows, like House of Cards was sort of like that first big one that I had started thinking like, well, that would actually be kind of cool to work on a show like that. And it sort of opened my eyes to it. And then it was just by coincidence around that time that The Expanse came along. And it was because of a local rental house in Toronto, Sim Digital. They had a lunch meeting with one of the line producers, and they were, I guess, the line producer who was Manny Danilon, who's from Toronto as well. He had was asking them, saying like, "Hey, we're doing this big show is coming to Toronto," and at the time it was the biggest science fiction show
Mhm.
of its kind, because Star Trek hadn't come back yet, so that was before Star Trek, came back.
Sure.
The Sim guys passed my name on to Manny, and then I got a phone call from him out of the blue saying, "Hey, I got your name from these guys at Sim who I knew, and we described the kind of DP we were looking for, and they said we should talk to you." And I guess they looked me up a little bit and saw my background, and Terry McDonough was the like producing director who was starting The Expanse, and he had at that time had just done Breaking Bad, and so he had some pretty good success himself, and he was a British director, but I didn't know him and I'd never worked with him. But
Mhm.
he had seen, I guess when they got my name, they'd showed him my work, and he had come from a documentary background as well, and he saw that in my reel and in my CV, and he's like, "This is the guy. We have to meet him." So when I went in to have an interview with them, Terry was there, and really he was my biggest proponent. I mean, he pushed them to consider me, and it's funny because one of the things they said to me up front was like, we're trying to find someone who's from outside the television box. We want someone who's going to bring something new to this. We like the idea of the fact that you've done documentary, because we want to kind of approach the show in that way with a sense of realism, but also someone who knows how to make things look good and has
Mhm.
technical abilities. So I guess I ticked all the boxes. So one of the other American producers asked me in that interview, they said, well, we see you haven't done any episodic television in your resume. So how are you going to do this? Which is kind of ironic because it was the same. They were like, we want someone who hasn't done it, but we also see you haven't done it. So how are you going to do this? To me, I look at this as I've done a lot of smaller things that are chunks of what this show is as a bigger whole. So I just kind of think of it as applying those same strategies to a thing that's going to be, instead of a few weeks of a shoot, it's like months of a shoot, and I can do that. And so when I finally actually got the job within that, a week or so later, it was a combination of super excited but also terrified, because I knew it was the biggest thing I'd ever done.
Sure.
And I was really going to have to draw upon everything I'd learned in like the 20 plus years up to that point of being in the business. I was going to have to literally use everything I had learned, and the rest is history, I guess you can say.
Yeah. And did it put pressure on you to come up with something new for them?
I mean, they already had the something new. Their concept was the something new. It was really about how do we like applying a philosophy to how we were going to light it and shoot it
Mhm.
that fit the world, because they had already created an amazing lookbook. They actually had Weta make this beautiful PDF that was like a 60-page lookbook of the show's world. And I'd read the script
Mhm.
and I looked at this lookbook, and I fell in love with the lookbook right away because I love the aesthetic and the vision of the future and all that. So they had kind of like that heavy lifting had been done. Now it was like, how do we light and shoot these worlds that have been beautifully rendered in these artist concepts? So, it was really about, okay, well, obviously we're going to have to create sets and environments that are completely 360 builds where there's ceilings, there's walls all around, so you can look in any direction, and it has to all be lit kind of practically, because if the sets have ceilings, you can't have like film lighting hanging above it like you would on a kind of a traditional set. So it was like my philosophy right away was like, we have to like build in a ton of LED lighting that we have to custom make to fit these sets. I mean, and that's how all these shows are done that way now. But that at
Now,
the time,
2014, it's
it
still
hadn't really
early.
been done
Yeah.
on that scale, and it was a big investment because those kinds of things you can't rent those lights. You have to buy that stuff. So you're literally buying like hundreds of thousands of dollars of LED ribbon and controllers and all that because you can't rent it. And you're cutting it up. It's a consumable item that basically once you've bought it, you own it. So they had to kind of take that leap of like, will this show have legs beyond the first season? Because if you're going to invest that kind of money, it works out great if it's going to get used for multiple seasons because you amortize it over that. But of course, nobody knows that in the first season of a show. So they had to take that risk. And all of us were basically telling the higher powers, like, this is how we have to do it and to convince them to spend that money.
Why do you think they took that risk?
I think because the people who were running it were smart. All the people involved were smart and understood that, knowing the world that they've set out to make, this is the way to do it. Everyone knew that. So it was just kind of like collectively getting everyone together into that mindset. But I mean, the show was very well run, and that's why I stayed with it for so long. I mean, the Narain, the showrunner, the Alcon people, the guys who wrote the books, Ty and Daniel, they were all equally involved and heavily involved, and they all are smart people and knew how to make a show like this from a technical level. So they gave me that freedom and they trusted me, which was interesting because they didn't know me. Like nobody knew who I was. I was kind of an unknown at that point, but I think there was a collective. I had a good plan. It all made sense, and the crew that I was working with, and the production team, and the production designer staff, everybody was like, "This is the way we have to make this show," and everyone got behind it, and that's what we did.
And you did a lot of tests, right, in terms of just camera movement and steady cam versus movie. Can you talk a little bit about like
Yeah,
what
we
was
did a
your
ton of
thinking going in?
testing. Yeah, I mean Terry was a big proponent. He really wanted the movie was new at the time, and it had just they just released the bigger model.
A
It was
movie being a
very, and
camera
he had seen.
stabilizer, right, just for people listening. Yeah, so it's a
That's
camera
right.
stabilizer, right? That's not you're not tied to like you are a steady cam, right?
Yeah, it's a well, it's also called a gimbal. You see it a lot now. It's a thing you can hold, and there's consumer versions of these things that can fit small cameras. And but at the time, it was new, and no one had ever used it on a big production in that sense. It was more of kind of like an indie filmmaker's tool at the time. And Terry had seen these demo videos of it because there was a lot of viral videos of people shooting these crazy shots with them
Going into
back in like
cars and stuff,
2013,
right? It's like they were
going
handing
from
off to
escape
people with
from like someone on
cars. Yeah.
rollerblades and into a taxi and all that. So I was like, that's great. And I had experience with them, but I'm like, he wanted to shoot the entire thing with it. And I'm like, we have to really test this because I don't have enough experience with it. And no one has to know that we can rely on this thing to shoot like the majority of the show that way. And he liked the look and feel of it and this thing, for zero gravity and the idea it could float through spaces. And anyways, we tested it. We did a lot of tests and we landed on that particular version of the movie. And that's kind of we use that tool heavily throughout the show. But
Yeah.
it was, I mean, again, Terry pushed for it. He really wanted it, and I actually, I don't think I would have considered it if it wasn't for the fact that he really wanted to try it.
From what I understand, Jeremy, is that TV shoots fast. I don't know with the era of the last 15 years of prestige TV if they give you more time. But what I've seen of The Expanse is that, and I know people get offended when I use this word with regards to TV, but it looked cinematic. And are you afforded more time on the TV set to achieve that look? I mean, I'm seeing camera movements in there and certain setups that you don't normally see in TV shows, or I haven't seen in many. With the major exception to me would be Peter Deming's work in Twin Peaks: The Return, which I thought
Mm-hmm.
looked very cinematic. Is there more pressure on you to get these shots and maintain the speed of television production?
Well, I mean, you could maybe if you compare it to the old model of a television show where you get like 8 days to make an episode.
Mm-hmm.
Now you get 9 days, or you get an extra day. And then they also do this thing with blocks where you're shooting two blocks or two episodes together as a block.
Mm-hmm.
So you're combining the resource. One director does the two episodes, and you're block shooting two episodes together, which there's a certain efficiency to that in terms of combining resources of prep. But then what they'll do is they'll do what they call double up days. Some shows call it tandem days, where the next block, which is directed by a different director, will overlap the outgoing block. So you actually have this period where there's almost like there's two blocks shooting at the same time. So you're in a way you're actually from an overall production schedule of the entire run of the season, you're actually gaining a day or two per block by combining the two blocks. So you have this overlap day where you bring in another supplemental crew to sort of shoot the first day or two of the incoming block while the outgoing block finishes. And that's a common thing now. It's a bit of a headache for all departments because then now everyone has to prep for the incoming block of the next episodes to be shooting at the same time as the outgoing one. And you have to have kind of like two sets running at the same time. So props, wardrobe, makeup, sets, lighting, everybody has to now like it's like a double workload for those couple of days. And it does afford you extra days in a sense and a little bit more resources because there's a savings overall at the end of the show. So it's kind of a blessing and a curse. Yes, you get a tiny bit more time, but you now have this like added headache of these double up days. So, and we basically did that throughout the entire run of the show. Like all 6 seasons we did that.
Right. I recently heard the cinematographer Roger Deakins. I know I think the idea might apply. I know we're talking, TV versus film, but he said that early on in his career, he worked on he called them rock promos. They were music videos and documentaries and documentaries. And that's what taught him to work fast and still achieve the look that he wanted, that the director wanted. I see that you have a very, very similar background. Was it music videos and documentary that gave you those skills to work in, this was your first foray into sci-fi and television, but did those skills help you in this new, or at the time, new venture?
100%. I drew so much from the documentary and music video world going into that Expanse that it was almost kind of like completely intertwined. I don't know if I could have pulled it off without having that background. I mean, that's the only background that I know, but I also know I fully drew from it, like the working with small resources and how to like think quickly, especially in a documentary world, when you have there's maybe no lighting department. It's just you and a sound person and maybe an assistant. And you're working in locations where you have available light, or you only have a couple of small lights, and it's you setting it up on your own. You kind of have to develop a set of instincts of knowing where to put the camera very quickly based on what the conditions give you.
Right.
So if you're walking into a place that you haven't necessarily had a chance to see before, and you have to shoot a sequence with a couple of people and they have to move through this space, whether it's outdoor, indoor, or a mix of both, you have to very quickly figure out what's the best way to do this visually that's going to look the best and tell the story. And you kind of you sharpen your skills that way, and you do get presented with that on an episodic kind of show or long format things where you have all these resources in the big machine, where you often have to like go back to that small mindset of like, if it was just me here and none of this giant machine, and we've got 5 minutes to make a decision, where does the camera go? And you have to block out all that giant circus of stuff there that you've got all these trucks and people and everything, but you're in a situation where you've got only a short running, out of time window to get the shot, and you have to think quickly of like, where do we put the camera in the least, amount of places to get what we have to get in like the hour we have left or whatever. And you are basically using all those skills that I find that I got from documentary. You're using those things when you're in those pressure moments of you've only got like you're running out of daylight, or we've got a child actor and they have to be off the clock in exactly 35 minutes and you've got 2 shots left to get. Where are you going to put the camera and how are you going to do it? And all those skills come into play at that point. All that knowledge of like documentary or music videos where you're working small and you have to get a whole bunch done in a small amount of time with limited resources. It scales up to on the bigger things.
I'm paraphrasing here. I don't remember the exact quote, but I got the gist of it. I remember a few years ago, somebody asked the director, David Fincher, what is directing? And they were expecting some lofty answer. And he said, directing is that you have 15 minutes left to get the shot and only 5 minutes of sunlight. That is directing. Do you find that even though this is, you're working as a cinematographer, do you find that, it sounds like you find that to be the case?
I mean, I'm in the same boat as the director. I mean, we're both faced with that same challenge, that we both have to work together in those sort of crisis time crunch moments of how can we how can we tell this story? How do we get what we have to get in this bit of time that we have left? And sometimes